What's up, fuckers? Welcome back to your weekly What's up, fuckers? Welcome back to NBER Weekly, your weekly uninformed undergraduate stumble through the cutting edge of economics. This week was a pretty good week. I've already had some time to go through these. There's a couple of papers where I only want to look through the extract, and then two banger I/O papers that I want to highlight because they interest me in particular. The first interesting paper is this one here, number 6. Abstract only. It's titled The Benefits of Scholastic Athletics, and it's what you'd expect. If you play sports in school, you're more likely to make friends. If you're poor, you're more likely to make friends who are rich, and therefore help you, scoot up the socioeconomic ladder. Turns out more networking opportunities equals more gooder. Who would have expected, but also good to know. The next interesting one, I think, is this paper titled The Illusion of Time, Gender Gaps in Job Search and Employment. It has to do with the female job search in Pakistan. And what they find is there's a very narrow window in which women have to apply for jobs in order to not have the employer sort of reject them out of fear that the woman is going to get married. And this super narrow window contributes to really high underemployment of women who've gone to college, and they find that providing a mild incentive to sort of apply super soon and get started before employees start worrying about their employee potentially marrying can really improve the outcomes for the employee. Of course, on the other hand, that does nothing to solve the fundamental problem of assuming that a woman is going to get married, or necessarily that marriage will have sufficiently negative labor market implications to prevent or to make you want to discriminate against her. But, there's a sense in which those broader systemic failures aren't necessarily the most immediately solvable. Another paper number 9 is also interesting, Tax Reform in the Laffer Curve. It essentially estimates the Laffer Curve by income distribution. And so for those of you who don't know what the Laffer Curve is, it's this basic theoretical framework about how we should set up our tax system. And the idea is, if you have 0% taxes, then, nobody pays any taxes, so you don't get any tax revenue. And if you have 100% tax revenue, then nobody has an incentive to earn money in the market, and then you make no tax revenue, and things are kaput from that end as well. But obviously we have taxes that raise some money, so somewhere in the middle, there must be a optimum, point where our taxes are raising the most money, and, maybe we should find that and optimize at that top point. The anthropologist in me would like to point out that often there's a considerable incentive for people to work to pay taxes, even at 100% income tax rate, in that the state will lock you in a cage for the rest of your life if you fail to. This is discussed in David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years, when he talks about Malagasy indigenous people having a head tax imposed upon them, which is, obviously different from an income tax, but they exhibited behavior where they worked in order to pay the full amount of that head tax and did not do any moneyed work beyond that. They stuck to the informal economy. So while there is, a point to be made about like tax revenue, especially tax revenue that we would consider legitimate in like a Western democratic context rather than like overt colonialism, I think the theoretical context, I think the theory in itself is a little shaky when it comes to external validity, more generally. But limiting ourselves to sort of, more narrow possible social orders, the Laffer curve is notoriously poorly conceived. I have this image of a particularly bad one saved on my desktop. Let me pull that up. Yes, here is a diagram of the quote-unquote Laffer curve put out by, I believe, Trump's Secretary of Treasury. I don't recall, so I'm not going to point fingers. But published by an important person in a major paper. And it basically draws this line from the low outlier to the high outlier to the middle of a whole bunch of dots and declares this the ultimate Laffer curve. When in reality, the Laffer curve starts down here at the low outlier, which is what the theory would predict. It's at 0, fantastic. And in fact, traces up through the rough OLS polynomial center of these dots and shoots up with a peak somewhere over here in the upper like 50 or 60%. Now, this Laffer curve is not what this paper is about. This paper is about estimating a different Laffer curve by industry or by wealth bracket. So, it's pretty fair to assume that people have diminishing returns on money, right? The more money you have, the less you want each next dollar. Think like, let me put it this way. If you're, Elon Musk, it's literally not worth your time to stop and bend over and pick up $100 bill because that $100 bill is such a low percentage of your wealth that it's just not worth the 5 or 6 seconds to you to do it. And that's a pretty common thing. And so what we might expect is a Laffer curve where the peak is more leftward, where in order to stop people from not finding it worthwhile to work more, the richer those people are, working more sort of rewards them less in theory, and therefore you would expect their Laffer curve to be shifted right. So you would want to tax them less in order to raise more money from them. And this is all and I will concede that and for the sake of argument, let's say that from a strictly governmental revenue proposition, this is true, right? If our only goal is to maximize government revenue, perhaps, I'll say, for the sake of argument. My point would be this ignores the pre-distributional effects of these policies. When an incredibly rich person decides to work less, and did Nelson fix my AC? Did you fix my AC? I remember it being broken, and now it's not. From a strictly governmental we'll say that's true. However, However, this ignores the pre-distributional effects of the However, this ignores the pre-distributional effects of the policy. When a super rich person is incentivized by a super duper right Laffer curve, oh fuck, I said left earlier, by a super duper right Laffer curve, when they're disincentivized from working for a lot of extra money, it's not like that money vanishes from the economy necessarily, right? Maybe they're pouring their entire, maybe they're choosing to not pour their entire productive effort and their intellectual genius into making all this extra output, but maybe instead they're exploiting their workers less. And so that money, instead of going to them, goes to their workers. And it is, in fact, even more redistributional than the Laffer curve implies in a more efficient manner because the government is no longer involved. It directly pre-distributes extra money into workers' pockets as opposed to having to get the government in the middle and redistribute it. Although, of course, the government's intervention is necessary for this pre-distributional effect to happen. If you haven't heard from my tone of voice, I favor pre-distribution. It is harder to study, and I've already talked about enough about this paper that I'm actually not going to read. So let's move on. The racial penalty in job ladder transitions. Interesting stuff. Pretty cool data using administrative government data, basically to look at the ways in which people changed jobs. And they find that black people tend to be forced to take a lower paying job when they're laid off. And white people tend to wait a little longer and end up back at the same pay level. So, sucks to be poor, sucks to be black. Sorry. Some international papers. The impact of unconditional cash transfers on parenting and children. This is an extension of one of the great big UBI research. Argument on whether it's actually UBI. Some people say it's not enough, but it is $1,000 a month. That's quite a bit. This is an extension of a previous experiment regarding it. I think it's kind of a bummer. It basically confirms my priors that UBI is important, but it's not everything. And it does show that it's really good. Basically, partway through the pandemic, they kept giving UBI to some people, compared them to people who did not get it, and saw the outcome on a whole bunch of different child-based outcomes of interest. Found parents had more time to take care of their children. Also found that parents reported more things wrong with their children, although it's possible that that's just because the parents can actually spend enough time to notice things are wrong with their children. No serious impact on immediate schooling outcomes, which, I don't know, bummer. Kind of, yeah. What I would be interested in here, particularly interested in, I should say, is that this UBI study seems to have come into play right around the same time we were having all those EITC-based shocks. For those, earned income tax credit is the main way we get money to poor people via the U.S. government. And in the middle of COVID, they basically increased the amount a whole bunch and made it so you could collect it every month instead of one huge lump sum. And that changed some things. And I'd be interested in a comparative analysis of the UBI to the EITC. Because I imagine most people who got the UBI also got the EITC. So I'm not sure if there's enough variation in there to sort of be able to compare the four groups, right? Neither UBI or EITC, UBI and EITC, neither nor. But if you could, I'd be interested. Interested enough to do it myself? No, but 16. Are hospital acquisitions of physician practices anti-competitive? Big I/O finding. I'm going to talk about that one specifically in a bit. 17. AI-powered trading, algorithmic collusion, and price efficiency. This paper is so cool. Like in itself, it's so cool. And then more generally, it's something, it confirms there's literature about something I've been suspicious of for a while. And you bet I'm going to be waving this paper around at people for a while to come. Credit access in the United States, sucks to be poor, sucks to be black. Among other stuff, right? I'm being glib because I'm tired of these correlational surveys that find it sucks to be poor. Number 20 here is super fun. It's a little bit of a manager science. It's titled Frontline Leadership, Evidence from American Civil War Captains. What a fun idea. What a fun everything. They find that having engaged lower level managers who are there, who lead from the front, who learn by doing, really increases unit effectiveness. And, they find that having such a manager, these managers aren't apparent going into the war, although during the war they're significantly higher rated by their troops. They lower desertion levels, and it's just a fun they also find that super engaged frontline leaders are more likely to die, which is to be expected in a military context. But I think it shows that the extent that what we sort of normally consider as a leading from the front leader is in fact a bit what they're measuring in here. Fantastic, love it. What fun, right? Ugh. Right, 175-year-old administrative data to prove that a good manager knows what his employees are doing. What fun. And that is in my opinion, the only interesting ones. There's like some sad ones also, some development ones. This one about religion that seems interesting, and this Brazilian one about like tax policy wrongness variations that honestly I couldn't make heads or tails of, so I'm just kind of skipping. A couple tariff ones because that's in the fucking news, but that's it for abstracts. On to the really exciting stuff. I've got this one, which is the Are Hospital Acquisitions of Physician Practices Anti-Competitive? And, okay. Healthcare econ is horrid. The basic outline here, hang on, let me get some fucking... Okay, let's hope you can still hear me. The basic outline The basic outline is it used to be you'd have the hospital where, a lot of the nursing services and stuff would get done. And then within the hospital, you'd have within the hospital or like nearby, you'd have a whole bunch of individual physician practices that sort of do their own thing. And, the basic assumption is that all of these physician practices compete with each other, and then they use the hospital as just sort of a neutral workshop where they get some upstream supply. Now, in recent years, the hospitals have actually been expanding and purchasing these individual physician practices until, you eventually get this large hospital physician system that, it doesn't look entirely like horizontal coordination. It looks like an upstream firm buying a whole bunch of teeny tiny downstream firms. And a pretty key word there is teeny tiny. These physician practices are so small that these mergers don't need to be reported to the federal government, making studying them and figuring out if they're bad pretty difficult. Nonetheless, that's what this paper tries to do. And the big question, you want to see the graph? We love the graphs. Here on this channel, here is the graph. Log prices over time. Here's our event study. The event happens, prices go up. Harm to the consumer shown. Get them, Lena. Lena's not in charge anymore. Let's put Lena back in charge, and then she can get them. Lena Khan, former FTC girly. Yes. Basically, the empirical method here is pretty interesting. They use public data on a number of mergers to hand-coded by some poor research assistant to basically train an AI to detect when mergers happen based on a whole bunch of stuff, and then use that to construct their merger database, and then also create an interesting demand estimating. Here's how that works out. Basically, they find that mergers happened. Shockers. And then they also do this really cool demand-based estimation of offset demand, which I'm not going to go into a ton how they did that. But it's super cool. And here they're basically pointing out that commuting zones aren't that great of a measure of market, especially in the context of hospitals, because people are willing to go so far to go to a hospital, which is something we knew already. But this is a cool way to display that and to sort of show that problem. Here's a graph sort of showing it. The darkness of the dots is how much their demand estimator finds. The scales are actually geographic location. So you can imagine this is like an anonymized map where they're only drawing the hospitals. And then these little diamondy ones sort of over here, including these low competition ones off to the side, are what traditional commuting zone measures would predict. And if you're not into I/O, I know you probably don't care, but I find this really cool. So they do their event study, prices go up. They do a whole bunch more empirical work. This is... I'm not going to go into depth about the empirical strategy here. It's neat. It's intelligently done. It's done in a very narrow way, and I don't know if that's actual data limitations, or they could find the effect without going crazy and doing a super complicated and no doubt much more computationally expensive methods, but, basically, they estimate different levels of effect of different pathways that this could happen. If you're into IO, foreclosure, foreclosure, recapture is an interesting thing here. You can basically think of it as increasing physicians' bargaining power upstream, where, So foreclosure would be the hospital reducing competition amongst the physicians. Recapture is basically making the upstream market less competitive. Upstream market being bargaining with insurance providers. And then there's just straight up making collusion among these people easier in that they're now all in the same hospital. Fun paper. Physician mergers are bad. It's also got a really nice set of references to a number of similar papers that find things like private equity roll-ups and mergers in the hospital system have all sorts of harrowing effects on patient outcomes, which, I don't know, I should do a video on said topics if I guess I'm becoming a tuber now, which we'll see. Paper of interest that I really liked, number 2, is this fascinating not double-spaced joint from finance, it actually looks like, called AI-Powered Trading, Algorithmic Collusion, and Price Efficiency. And I get the sense that this paper is about AI as a buzzword, but also about class war if you have the right eyes. Or many would argue, in my case, the wrong eyes. Nonetheless, I find it quite interesting. They set up a theoretical financial market where, you have a whole bunch of different types of actors. Basically, you have your fucking super locked in high information hedge fund traders and your sleepy institutional investors, right? Your momentum funds or whatever the fuck. Not momentum funds, your index funds and pension funds and whatever the fuck. And they set up this market that, I don't know, I'm not a finance guy, seems like a reasonable approximation of financial markets to me. And then they set up a whole bunch of AI traders to go in the market and trade. Now, if you are a layman whose experience to AI, whose exposure to AI is ChatGPT, these agents aren't what you think they are. It's better to think of these little critters as much more purpose-built for stock trading. They run on the same fundamental principles where they try a whole bunch of different shit and then keep doing the things that work. But instead of trying to generate text, they trade stocks efficiently. So it's not like ChatGPT AI, but it's not like... It's still vaguely the same concept. Not going to get into the minutia of AI here, but, read the fucking paper if you care. And so, right, they recognize that basically in these scenarios, you have a setting where if all of these high information traders trade aggressively based on their information, they can make a bit of money, but not a ton. But if they all agreed to trade not super based on their information and to sort of collude to artificially inflate the price, then they can make considerably more money than, if they could otherwise. The catch is these are all little black box computers that aren't allowed to talk to each other in any way, shape, or form. This isn't even like where you have a stockbroker who goes to the same fucking strip club as his mate at Merrill Lynch and, they can collude over martinis or whatever the fuck drink rich people drink. Probably not martinis. But these AI have to somehow, without the ability to meaningfully communicate with each other in any way except for the price, collude and increase their profits. Which, if you're a free market guy, you'd be like, no, that would never happen. These AI can always maximize short-run profits, and since they're profit-interested agents, you can never have the collusive equilibrium arise even in a context where they could communicate, let alone where they can't communicate and can only communicate based on price signals. That would be crazy. That would disprove the idea that the free market is the best way to regulate our financial markets, and by extension, every other market on the planet. And that would be crazy. Who would want that? I have been talking for 32 fucking minutes? That'd be crazy! But, no. These researchers find that these AI, through two different methods, having no theoretical conception of coordination, that these AI can develop coordinated cartel equilibriums with the price above the Nash equilibrium, market fair price. Which, wig, that's crazy. But basically they find there are these two potential channels. One is where the AI uses the price as a signal to the other AI. And they sort of learn very steadily over time, okay, if everybody's being a bit conservative and not trading super heavy on information, I can play it a bit more conservatively. And that sometimes nets me in the long run more profit than if I'd played super aggressively. And so they steadily build up this tit-for-tat strategy, where if everybody else plays conservatively, they play conservatively. But in the next iteration, if in the price they see evidence of aggressive play, they switch to playing aggressively. And, A, tit-for-tat shows its ugly face once again. Who would have thought? B, crazy. Markets aren't competitive. And if this stupid fucking, Q tree in a black box with no economics theory and no context to anything outside of itself can figure this out, perhaps, perchance, this is not what the authors suggest, this is my speculation, but maybe this sort of thing could be going on among humans, too. But anyway, they call this collusion by artificial intelligence because it's sort of a pretty advanced strategy that does show a degree of intelligence. This is evolved, game theoretical, pretty cool advanced strategy. Awesome. Amazing. They do also show collusion by artificial stupidity, where if that price signal is too jittery to really be able to get any information about it, right? Like, if you're relying on the price to tell you if everybody's playing conservatively or aggressively, but then the price just has a fuckload of random noise, it's not useful for that. So they have this second, the AI actually develops this second method of collusion that is actually more effective when prices are super jittery. That's what this graph here is showing you. You have your perfect cartel price level up here, your non-collusive price level down here, and this blue line is where the AIs get to, with obviously the variance in gray. And you can see down at these relatively low price noisinesses, they find it pretty easy to set up this price equilibrium. Then, as prices get noisier and noisier and noisier, it's hard for them, right? They get really almost all the way down to the non-collusive equilibrium. The point they never actually get to the non-collusive equilibrium can be made. I'm not going to make too much hay out of it, because one could very easily argue that's just an artifact of how the models are, and as not a finance person, I wouldn't know. But then they show this second coercive method, cartelling method. I shouldn't say coercive because this isn't market power, so nobody's actually being coerced. The second cartelling behavior, where prices are so noisy that it's not that good an idea to be an information trader, basically happens. And basically, okay, it has to do with how the AIs work and learn specifically, which is they do a thing, and if the thing is good for them, they do more of that thing, and if the thing is bad for them, they do less of that thing. And this points out that the AI basically evaluates its strategy on a short-run basis, even if its long-term goal is, like, long-term. So, the AI, in a very price-noisy scenario, the AI will get punished for trading on information, and then decide to not trade on information and trade more and trade more conservatively. And, but if they do trade aggressively on information, they trade aggressively on information again, and therefore have more opportunity to be punished for it, right? This basically suggests that these AI have a tendency to be insufficiently creative or suboptimally creative in super jittery and super random environments, to the point where they will sort of naturally slide into this more conservative method away from the Nash equilibrium, and then it just sort of keeps working to them as more of them slide, and it transitions into becoming a collusive equilibrium, to the point where even aggressively trading, or trading based on information, even though it would give them a short-run benefit, is even, like, in the longer term, doesn't make a ton of sense. And there's no punishment against it, because, again, it's just a whole bunch of these AI naturally sliding into this collusive equilibrium via feedback loop, and an unwillingness to take risks. But, yeah. And I'm sure there's firm dynamic research that's much more aggressive and well-informed than I, but I haven't read it, and you can sure as hell bet I'm going to use this paper that confirms my priors when I'm debating people. If you know of any research that would be like that, I'd actually read it. Send it my way. But yeah, I should also caveat that there's a whole bunch of math in this paper that went a bit over my head. I didn't take the time to study like the internals of these AI models, as perhaps one in the field might, but not my field, not my problem. Right. Anything new happening at the Justice Department or the DOJ? Let us see. There was, oh right, they fucking let a whole bunch of companies merge. I'm not in the drama. I'm not gonna commentate on it. Fuck the Trump DOJ. Fuck the Trump FTC. Right? Reopens and sets aside Exxon Pioneer final order. Reopens and sets aside Chevron Hess final order. Fuck it. Let's let oil companies just merge with whoever the fuck they want. Because they lobbied $1 zillion. Fuck! Okay. I don't know. Yeah. That's it for economics news. Is there anything interesting I should say here?